People think the underworld is entirely about blood, omerta, and cold executions in the back of Brooklyn diners. They don't tell you about the quiet, breathless moments that violently shift the balance of power. When a notoriously ruthless syndicate boss found his overlooked heavyweight secretary shivering on a soaking wet park bench in a torrential downpour, nobody expected him to stop. What he did next didn't just break the ironclad rules of the Mafia, it triggered a brutal war. Listen closely, because the truth is darker than fiction. If you walk past the glass-paneled facade of Santoro Holdings on 58th Street in Manhattan, you would see nothing but a legitimate, high-end logistics corporation. You would see men in $6,000 Brioni suits and women with razor-sharp cheekbones clicking their stilettos across Italian marble floors. You wouldn't see the blood money, the imported contraband, or the iron grip the Santoro family held over the eastern seaboard's shipping ports, and you certainly wouldn't notice Penelope Sullivan. Penelope was the executive secretary to the CEO, but she might as well have been part of the mahogany furniture. At 28 years old, Penelope was fat. Not curvy in the socially acceptable hourglass way that the media liked to spin, but genuinely, heavily fat. She wore a size 22, hiding her soft, expansive body inside sensible dark navy cardigans and loose-fitting slacks. In a corporate environment engineered for superficial perfection, Penelope was a walking anomaly. The junior associates mocked her behind her back. The sleek, size 2 receptionists sneered at her lunch choices, but Penelope endured it all with quiet, agonizing dignity, because she possessed something none of the pretty faces did. Absolute, flawless competence. She managed the private ledgers. She knew exactly which shell companies funneled cash to the precinct captains, and she knew exactly how the CEO liked his black coffee. 2 drops of cold water to cut the acidity. The CEO was Leo Santoro. Leo was 34, standing 6'3", with shoulders like a prize fighter, and eyes as cold and flat as a frozen lake. He had taken over the family syndicate 3 years ago, after his father was gunned down in a Bronx bakery. Leo didn't rule with the loud, boisterous violence of his predecessors. He ruled with terrifying, clinical silence. When a lieutenant crossed him, there was no shouting. The man simply vanished. Leo spoke softly, moved deliberately, and terrified every single soul in the 5 boroughs, except strangely Penelope. To Penelope, Leo was a force of nature, a terrifying but consistent orbit. She had worked for him for 3 years, handing him files, scheduling his meetings at the dockyards, and acting as the invisible wall between him and the rest of the world. He rarely spoke to her beyond brief, clipped orders. He never commented on her weight, never looked at her with the disgust she saw in the eyes of his underbosses. But he also never looked at her as a woman. To him, she was a machine. A brilliant, quiet machine, or so she thought. Behind Penelope's flawless corporate mask, her life was collapsing into absolute ruin. It wasn't the kind of ruin that happens overnight, but the slow, suffocating drowning of poverty and family loyalty. Her younger brother, Tommy, was a degenerate gambler with a penchant for chemical dependencies. A year ago, Tommy had borrowed $60,000 from the O'Connor brothers, a vicious, splintered Irish mob operating out of Hell's Kitchen. Tommy defaulted, and the O'Connors came to Penelope. They didn't threaten to kill her. They threatened to skin Tommy alive and leave him on her doorstep. For 12 agonizing months, Penelope had been bleeding herself dry. She handed over every single paycheck from Santoro Holdings, living off instant ramen and tap water. She sold her mother's jewelry. She sold her car. She walked 50 blocks to work to save on subway fare. Her large body ached, her joints protested, and her spirit was ground into fine dust. The tipping point arrived on a bleak Friday in late October. Penelope's landlord, a ruthless slumlord in Astoria, had finally had enough of her missed rent payments. When she returned to her dingy basement apartment after a 14-hour shift managing Leo's chaotic schedule, she found the locks changed. A single black trash bag containing her few remaining clothes was sitting on the concrete stoop. Nailed to the peeling wood of the door was a brightly colored eviction notice. She was entirely, hopelessly alone. Her phone was dead. Her bank account was overdrawn by $40. She had nowhere to go. Tommy had skipped town 2 weeks prior, fleeing the O'Connors and leaving Penelope to face the wrath of the Irish mob by herself. As she stood on the stoop, staring at the black trash bag, the sky above Queens broke open. It didn't just rain. It was a torrential, freezing nor'easter. The kind of rain that felt like icy needles, instantly soaking through her thin cardigan and chilling her down to the bone. Penelope picked up the heavy bag, her thick fingers trembling as the plastic dug into her skin. She began to walk. She didn't know where she was going. Her wet clothes clung uncomfortably to her heavy thighs, the friction burning her skin with every step. Cars drove by, their tires kicking up waves of muddy street water that splashed against her calves. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked twice at the fat, soaking, wet woman dragging a garbage bag through the dark streets of Astoria. She was invisible. She had always been invisible. She walked until her legs simply gave out. On a dark, empty stretch of Ditmars Boulevard, beneath the flickering, dying light of a broken street lamp, Penelope collapsed onto a green wooden bus stop bench. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her large arms around her shivering body, trying to make herself as small as possible. The rain beat down on her hair, pasting it to her cheeks. For the first time in her life, Penelope Sullivan broke. She buried her face in her wet knees and sobbed. She cried for her brother. She cried for her empty bank account. And most of all, she cried because she knew she was going to die out here, and the world wouldn't even notice there was an empty desk on Monday morning. She closed her eyes, letting the freezing rain wash over her, resigning herself to the cold dark. She didn't hear the roar of the engines until the brilliant, blinding white of high-beam headlights illuminated the rain in front of her. Penelope squinted against the blinding glare. The headlights belonged to a massive armored Mercedes Maybach, flanked by 2 black Cadillac Escalades. The vehicles were entirely blacked out, looking like mechanical predators prowling through the storm. The convoy had come to a sudden, screeching halt right in front of the bus stop. The heavy hum of the V12 engines vibrated through the wet concrete beneath Penelope's feet. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her first terrified thought was the O'Connors. They had found her. They were going to drag her into the back of an SUV, and that would be the end of it. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the rough hands of Irish enforcers. Instead, she heard the heavy, solid thud of a car door opening, followed by the rhythmic, unhurried sound of expensive leather shoes splashing against the flooded pavement. "Boss, you shouldn't be out here. We have a perimeter to maintain," a gruff voice called out from the rain. Penelope's eyes snapped open. She knew that voice. It was Dante, Leo Santoro's terrifying head of security. Through the sheet of heavy rain, a tall, imposing silhouette walked into the halo of the headlights. He wasn't carrying an umbrella. The freezing water darkened his tailored charcoal suit, slicking his black hair against his forehead. It was Leo. Penelope sat paralyzed, looking up at the most dangerous man in New York City. Her brain completely short-circuited. What was the head of the Santoro Syndicate doing on a desolate street in Queens at 2 a.m? Leo stopped 3 feet from the bench. His cold, dark eyes swept over her. He took in the saturated, clinging cardigan, the black garbage bag sitting in the puddle beside her, and her pale, trembling lips. For a terrifying, silent moment, he just stared at her. Penelope felt a hot flush of deep, humiliating shame wash over her. She knew exactly what she looked like. A pathetic, overweight mess. A stray dog left in the gutter. She tried to pull her cardigan tighter, trying to hide the bulk of her body, wishing the concrete would open up and swallow her whole. "Penelope," Leo said. His voice wasn't a question. It was a low, rumbling command that cut through the roaring sound of the storm. "Mr. Santoro," she chattered, her teeth clicking together uncontrollably. I'm sorry. I'm just waiting for the bus." "There are no buses running on this route after midnight," Leo stated, his gaze never leaving her face. He stepped closer. The sheer, overwhelming aura of violence and authority rolling off him made her want to shrink even further. "Why are you sitting in the freezing rain with a garbage bag, Penelope?" The shame choked her. She couldn't tell the Mafia boss that his executive secretary was a homeless beggar. "I had a disagreement with my landlord. It's fine, I'm fine. You should go, sir. You'll ruin your suit." Leo's jaw tightened. A muscle feathered in his cheek. Without a single word, he reached out and grabbed the black trash bag with his left hand. "Hey! Wait, that's mine!" Before she could finish, Leo reached down with his right hand, gripped her upper arm with astonishing strength and hauled her to her feet. Penelope gasped, her heavy body stumbling forward against his solid chest. She expected him to shove her away in disgust. Instead, his grip tightened, supporting her weight effortlessly. "Get in the car," Leo ordered. "No, Mr. Santoro. Please, I'll ruin the interior. I'm soaked. I'm too big. I can't." "I said get in the car," Leo growled, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal edge that brooked zero defiance. Dante, the massive bodyguard, had rushed forward with a large black umbrella, holding it over Leo. Dante looked at Penelope, his eyes widening in absolute shock. The men in the Santoro family knew who Penelope was. They knew she was the invisible, heavy girl who fetched the coffee. Seeing their terrifying boss violently hauling her into his personal Maybach was like watching the sky turn green. "Boss?" Dante asked, deeply confused. "We're exposed here. Put her bag in the trunk," Leo barked at Dante, shoving the trash bag into the bodyguard's chest. Leo didn't wait for Penelope to walk. He kept his iron grip on her arm, marching her to the open rear door of the Maybach. He practically pushed her inside the cavernous, cream leather interior, before sliding in beside her and slamming the heavy door shut. The silence inside the cabin was immediate and deafening. The storm was entirely blocked out by the armored glass. The air smelled of expensive cologne, cedarwood, and leather. Penelope pressed herself against the far door, terrified of her wet clothes staining the immaculate custom seating. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently, a puddle of rainwater forming at her feet. The driver in the front, separated by a glass partition, didn't dare look back. "Drive! The Tribeca property!" Leo commanded through the intercom. "Mr. Santoro, please," Penelope whispered, her voice cracking. Tears of pure humiliation mixed with the rainwater on her face. "You can just drop me at a shelter. You don't have to do this. I'm a mess." Leo slowly turned his head to look at her. In the dim, ambient lighting of the luxury car, his eyes were inscrutable. He reached into the compartment between them, pulling out a heavy, heated cashmere blanket. He didn't hand it to her. He leaned over, his massive frame boxing her in, and draped the thick cashmere tightly around her shaking shoulders. His knuckles brushed against her wet neck, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. "You manage my life, Penelope," Leo said softly, the lethal edge completely gone from his voice, replaced by something dark and intensely focused. "You know my schedules. You know my accounts. You know where the bodies are buried. Do you honestly think I would let the woman who holds my entire empire together freeze to death on a public bench?" Penelope stared at him, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. "I'm just a secretary." Leo's eyes dropped briefly to her lips, then back to her eyes. "You're a lot of things, Penelope, but just a secretary has never been one of them." He leaned back into his seat, fixing his cuffs as if he hadn't just shattered the entire reality of her world. "Now, you are going to sit there. You're going to get warm. And when we get to my home, you are going to tell me exactly who the fuck put you on the street. Because by tomorrow morning, they won't be breathing." The absolute terrifying certainty in his voice made Penelope shudder. But this time, it wasn't from the cold. The Maybach descended into a private, subterranean garage beneath a sleek, modern skyscraper in Tribeca. The elevator ride up to the penthouse was agonizingly silent. Penelope clutched the cashmere blanket around her large frame, feeling utterly out of place. Her wet sneakers squeaked against the polished steel floor. She felt monstrously huge standing next to Leo, acutely aware of the space she took up, the water dripping from her hair, and the pathetic reality of her existence. When the elevator doors parted, they opened directly into a sprawling, two-story penthouse wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic, stormy view of the Manhattan skyline. The place was a fortress of dark wood, slate, and minimalist luxury. An older woman in a neat grey uniform immediately appeared from a hallway. This was Mrs. Gable, Leo's deeply loyal housekeeper, a woman who had seen the bloody aftermath of Mafia business more times than she could count. "Mr. Santoro, you're back early." Mrs. Gable stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes landing on Penelope. "Mrs. Gable," Leo said smoothly, shrugging off his wet suit jacket and tossing it over a chair. "Draw a hot bath in the East Guest Suite. Find some dry clothes. My heavy sweatpants and one of my large sweaters will do for now." "Right away, sir." The housekeeper nodded, recovering her composure instantly and disappearing down the hall. Leo turned to Penelope. "Go with her. Get warm. Come to the study when you're done." He didn't ask. He commanded. 45 minutes later, Penelope stood in front of a mirror in the opulent guest bathroom. The hot water had thawed the ice in her veins, but looking at herself brought a fresh wave of anxiety. She was wearing Leo's dark grey sweatpants. They were massive, even on her, the drawstring tied tightly around her waist to keep them up. The black cashmere sweater she wore belonged to him, too. It smelled sharply of his cedarwood cologne. The sleeves were rolled up, but the garment draped comfortably over her thick curves, hiding her stomach and hips. For the first time in years, she felt physically safe, entirely enveloped by the scent and size of the man she feared and revered. She walked barefoot out of the suite and padded softly down the long, shadowed hallway toward the study. The door was ajar. Leo was sitting behind a massive oak desk, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. He had showered and changed into a pair of dark slacks and a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the intricate dark ink of syndicate tattoos winding up his forearms. He looked up as she entered. His eyes did a slow, deliberate sweep of her body. Penelope's instinct was to cross her arms, to shrink, to apologize for stretching his expensive sweater. But the look in Leo's eyes wasn't disgust. It was something heavy, predatory, and surprisingly possessive. "Sit," he murmured, nodding to a leather armchair across from his desk. She sat, the leather sighing beneath her weight. Leo poured a second glass from a crystal decanter of Macallan 25 and pushed it across the desk toward her. "Drink. It'll finish warming your blood." Penelope picked up the glass with trembling fingers and took a sip. The scotch burned beautifully down her throat, settling the frantic beating of her heart. "I'll have my men wire your landlord the back rent tomorrow," Leo said casually, leaning back in his chair. "Though I doubt he'll be in any condition to collect it after Dante pays him a visit." Penelope's eyes widened in horror. "No, Mr. Santoro, please. It wasn't my landlord's fault. I owe money. A lot of money. I haven't paid rent in 6 months." Leo's eyes narrowed, the relaxed posture vanishing instantly. He placed his glass down on the desk with a sharp clack. "You make a 6-figure salary at my company, Penelope. You manage millions of dollars of my money every day without missing a single cent. Why are you broke?" Penelope stared into her glass. The shame was suffocating. But lying to a mafia boss was a death sentence. And more than that, after what he had done for her tonight, she found she couldn't lie to him. "My brother," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Tommy, he has a gambling problem. He got in deep with some very bad people. I've been giving them my salary to keep them from hurting him. But Tommy vanished, and they came for the principal. I had nothing left." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Leo's face turned into a mask of carved stone. "Who?" Leo asked. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of an execution order. Penelope swallowed hard. "The O'Connor brothers, from Hell's Kitchen." For a long, agonizing moment, Leo didn't move. He didn't blink. The silence stretched so tightly it felt like a oncer about to snap. Then a dark, dangerous smile slowly spread across his face, a smile that made Penelope's blood run cold. "The O'Connors," Leo repeated, his voice practically a purr. "You know them?" she asked timidly. "Know them?" Leo stood up slowly, walking around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her chair. He leaned against the edge of the oak desk, towering over her. "Penelope, for the last 3 months, someone has been feeding the DEA information about my shipping containers at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We lost $4 million in untaxed merchandise." Penelope nodded slowly. She knew this. She had seen the red ink in the ledgers. "I just found out yesterday," Leo continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "that the rats selling me out to the feds are the O'Connor brothers. They are trying to cripple my supply lines so they can move their own narcotics through my ports." Penelope's heart dropped into her stomach. "Oh my God," she breathed. "And now?" Leo reached out, his large, rough hand gently grasping her chin, tilting her face up to meet his dark, burning eyes. His thumb brushed over her soft, full cheek. "I find out that these same Irish rats have been starving my secretary, bleeding the woman who runs my life." The touch of his hand sent a shockwave of heat straight down her spine. No man had touched her with such focused intent in her entire life. She was utterly paralyzed by the proximity of his broad chest, the smell of the scotch on his breath, and the sudden, terrifying realization of what this meant. Mr. Santoro, she stammered. Leo, he corrected softly, his thumb tracing her lower lip. My name is Leo. Leo, she gasped, her chest heaving beneath his sweater. What are you going to do? What am I going to do? Leo chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. He let go of her chin, standing up to his full, intimidating height. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the storm raging over the city. Tomorrow night, the O'Connors are hosting a sit-down at their private club in the meat-packing district. I was planning on ignoring it until I had more proof. He turned back to her, his eyes blazing with absolute, unhinged violence. But now they've touched something that belongs to me. Penelope gasped. Something that belongs to me. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. You are going to sleep in that bed tonight, Penelope, Leo commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. And tomorrow, you aren't going to the office. Tomorrow, you're going to sit right beside me when I tear the O'Connor syndicate down to the fucking studs. Penelope realized with absolute clarity that the rainstorm hadn't been the worst of her problems. She hadn't just been rescued. She had just been pulled into the very center of a mafia war, anchored to a monster who had suddenly, inexplicably, decided she was his to protect. And the most terrifying part of all, she didn't want to leave. Sunlight, muted and grey by the lingering storm clouds, filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Tribeca penthouse. Penelope woke in a bed the size of a small island, the high-thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets tangled around her legs. For a fraction of a second, she thought the previous night was a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by hypothermia and despair. Then she smelled the lingering scent of cedarwood on the massive black sweater she was still wearing. She sat up, her heavy body sinking into the mattress. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a freight train. She was in the home of Leo Santoro. She had exposed her pathetic life, her debt, and her brother's mess to the most lethal man on the eastern seaboard. A soft knock at the bedroom door made her jump. Mrs. Gable entered, carrying a silver tray with a steaming carafe of coffee and a plate of pastries. "Good morning, Miss Sullivan," the housekeeper said warmly, setting the tray down on a glass side table. "Mr. Santoro requested you join him in the dining room once you are awake, and he asked me to give you this." Mrs. Gable handed Penelope a thick ivory envelope. Inside was a single black Amex card with Penelope's name embossed on the front, along with a handwritten note in Leo's sharp, aggressive script. "No more instant ramen. Eat." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to be weak today. 10 minutes later, washed and still wearing Leo's oversized clothes, Penelope walked into the expansive dining area. Leo was seated at the head of a long mahogany table, a tablet in one hand and an espresso in the other. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, a gun holster strapped over his broad shoulders, completely unapologetic about the heavy black Glock resting against his ribs. "Sit," he commanded, without looking up. Penelope obeyed, taking the seat to his immediate right. "I have a team from Bergdorf Goodman arriving in 20 minutes, Leo said, finally setting the tablet down and locking his dark eyes on her. "They are going to measure you, and they are going to construct a dress for you by 7 o'clock tonight." Penelope's hands trembled in her lap. "Leo, Mr. Santoro, I don't need a dress. I don't wear dresses. I wouldn't even know what to ask them for. My body isn't built for designer." "Stop," Leo interrupted, his voice low but slicing through her insecurities like a scalpel. He leaned closer, the scent of espresso and danger rolling off him. "For 3 years, I have watched you hide yourself in oversized cardigans and baggy slacks. You make yourself invisible because you think your size is a liability. It isn't. His gaze dropped to her collarbone, then back up to her eyes, heavy with unfiltered heat. Tonight, you are walking into a room full of predators. You are going to wear silk, you are going to take up space, and you are going to let them see exactly who I am tearing their empire down for. Before Penelope could process the terrifying, intoxicating weight of his words, the heavy double doors of the penthouse swung open. Dante, the hulking head of security, marched into the room. His face was a mask of grim urgency. In his massive fist, he held a man by the back of the neck, a battered, bloody associate Penelope recognized vaguely from the shipping docks. "Boss," Dante grunted, throwing the man onto the hardwood floor. "We cracked the leak." Leo didn't flinch. He casually took a sip of his espresso. And? It wasn't a sophisticated wiretap, and it wasn't the DEA doing footwork, Dante said, his eyes briefly flicking toward Penelope with a look of profound pity. The O'Connors had an inside man, someone with access to the executive schedules, someone who knew which containers had the tax stamps and which ones had the merchandise. Penelope's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table. Someone with access to the executive schedules. She was the only one with that access. "I didn't do it," Penelope gasped, absolute terror crushing her chest. "Leo, I swear to God, I never breathed a word to them. I would never betray you." "I know you didn't," Leo said softly, his eyes never leaving her face. He looked back at Dante. "Say the name." It was her brother. "Boss," Dante growled. "Tommy Sullivan." He stole copies of the manifest from her apartment a month ago. He traded the shipping routes to the O'Connors to wipe his gambling debt clean. Tommy sold us out. The room started to spin. Penelope couldn't breathe. The air was sucked completely out of her lungs. Her own brother. The brother she had starved for. The brother she had ruined her life to protect. Had stolen from her to betray the Santoro family. By the strict, merciless laws of La Cosa Nostra, blood paid for blood. Tommy was a dead man, and as his blood relative and the source of the leak, Penelope was supposed to share his grave. She stood up so fast, her chair tipped over, crashing loudly onto the floor. She collapsed to her knees beside it, her heavy body shaking violently. She didn't beg for her life. She knew how this world worked. "Do it," she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the cold steel of Leo's Glock to press against the back of her head. "Just make it fast. Please." Silence hung in the room. A terrible, heavy silence. Then she heard the scrape of Leo's chair. Footsteps approached. But instead of a gun, rough, calloused hands gripped her upper arms and hauled her forcefully to her feet. Penelope opened her eyes to find Leo inches from her face. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched violently. He looked furious, but the fury wasn't directed at her. "Look at me," he snarled. When she couldn't meet his gaze, he shook her gently. "I said, look at me." She forced her tear-filled eyes up. "I don't kill what is mine," Leo stated, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that shook her to her core. "Your brother made his bed. If Dante finds him, he will die. But you are not your brother. You are the woman who held my empire together while he tried to tear it apart." He pulled her flush against his chest. The contact was electric, a shocking collision of her soft, expansive curves against his hard, heavily muscled frame. "You aren't going to die today, Penelope," Leo whispered fiercely against her ear, sending shivers cascading down her spine. But you are going to watch the men who used him burn to ash. Get dressed." The meatpacking district at midnight was a playground for the wealthy and the wicked. Cobblestone streets were lined with exclusive nightclubs where entry required either a trust fund or a loaded weapon. The Iron and Oak was an underground cigar lounge and a legal casino operated by Declan O'Connor, the ruthless head of the Irish syndicate. A convoy of 4 black Escalades and Leo's armored Maybach rolled to a smooth stop outside the club's unmarked steel door. Inside the Maybach, Penelope sat paralyzed with nervous energy. She looked entirely unrecognizable. The Bergdorf Goodman tailors had performed a miracle in 8 hours. She wore a deep emerald green silk wrap dress that clung to her heavy curves with breathtaking elegance. The plunging V-neck accentuated the swell of her large breasts, and the cinched waist drew attention to the sheer volume of her hips. Her dark hair was pinned up in loose, romantic waves, and her lips were painted a dark, bruised red. For the first time in 28 years, Penelope didn't feel fat. She felt dangerous. Leo sat beside her in a bespoke, pitch-black suit. He hadn't stopped looking at her since she stepped out of the guest suite. His gaze was heavy, possessive, and entirely devoid of his usual coldness. "Ready?" he asked, his hand resting casually on her thick thigh. The heat of his palm seared through the silk, making her breath hitch. "I'm terrified," she admitted honestly. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Just stay beside me," Leo said. He opened the door and stepped out into the damp night air. Dante and 8 heavily armed Santoro enforcers had already secured the perimeter. The bouncers at the door of the Iron and Oak were unconscious on the cobblestones. Leo reached into the car, took Penelope's hand, and helped her out. He didn't let go. He intertwined his fingers with hers, a public, undeniable declaration of possession, and led her down the concrete stairs into the subterranean club. The air inside was thick with blue cigar smoke and the smell of expensive whiskey. The music had been cut. At the far end of the room, sitting around a circular felt poker table, were Declan and Liam O'Connor, flanked by a dozen heavily tattooed Irish muscle. Declan, a scarred man with pale eyes and a cruel smile, looked up as the doors banged open. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw the sheer number of guns pointed at him, but then his eyes landed on Leo. "Leo Santoro," Declan drawled, leaning back in his chair. "A bit rude, barging in uninvited. And who is this lovely creature?" Declan squinted through the smoke, and then a cruel, barking laugh erupted from his throat. "Well, I'll be damned if it isn't the Sullivan piggy bank. I've got to say, Penelope, you look a lot better in silk than you do crying on the phone, begging for an extension." Penelope flinched, her grip tightening on Leo's hand. Leo didn't react. His face was a mask of terrifying, unnatural calm. He walked slowly toward Santom onto the table, pulling Penelope along with him until they stood just feet away from Declan. "You've had a busy month, Declan," Leo said, his voice quiet, forcing the entire room to strain to hear him. "You bought a DEA agent. You hijacked $4 million in untaxed electronics from the Navy Yard. You thought I was growing soft. Business is business, Leo," Declan sneered, though a bead of sweat appeared on his forehead. "Your father would have seen it coming. You? You're too busy playing corporate CEO and relying on a fat, desperate secretary whose own junkie brother sold you out. That's just pathetic." A tense silence fell over the room. The Irish goons shifted their weight, hands hovering over their holsters. Dante and the Santoro men raised their suppressed weapons. Leo let go of Penelope's hand. He casually reached inside his tailored jacket. The Irish enforcers twitched, but Leo only pulled out a folded piece of paper and dropped it onto the green felt of the poker table. "That," Leo said softly, "is the routing number to your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. As of 10 minutes ago, it has been drained. Every penny you've stolen, every dime you've made from the ports has been redirected into a blind trust." Declan's face drained of color. He snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the numbers. "You're bluffing. You couldn't bypass the encryption." "I didn't," Leo said, stepping closer. "She did." Leo nodded slightly toward Penelope. Declan glared at her, pure hatred in his eyes. "You?" Penelope stood tall. Her fear was suddenly eclipsed by a surge of vindictive power. She had spent the entire afternoon in Leo's study, hacking into the O'Connors' shell companies using the very financial pathways she managed for Leo. "Your routing protocols were amateur, Mr. O'Connor," Penelope said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I wiped you out in 45 minutes. "You fucking bitch!" Liam O'Connor roared, reaching for the heavy revolver tucked into his waistband. The violence that followed was explosive, deafening, and over in less than 10 seconds. Dante and the Santoro enforcers didn't hesitate. The sharp, mechanical thwip, thwip, thwip of suppressed gunfire filled the room. Blood sprayed across the expensive leather couches and the mahogany bar. Liam took 2 rounds to the chest and collapsed over the poker table, dead before he hit the felt. The rest of the Irish muscle was gunned down with surgical precision. Penelope squeezed her eyes shut and covered her ears, letting out a short cry. Instantly, a heavy, solid body shielded her. Leo had pulled her flush against his chest, tucking her head under his chin, his broad back absorbing the chaotic spray of glass and wood splinters. When the gunfire ceased, the only sound left was the groaning of dying men and the clinking of brass casings rolling across the floor. Leo stepped back, keeping one arm securely wrapped around Penelope's waist. Declan was on his knees, clutching a shattered shoulder, gasping in agony. He looked up at the massacre around him, his empire destroyed in the blink of an eye. Leo walked over to Declan, the soles of his Oxford shoes crunching on broken glass. He looked down at the bleeding mobster, with eyes as cold and empty as a grave. "You touched my ports," Leo whispered. He drew his Glock. "I can forgive that. It's business." He racked the slide, chambering around. "But you threatened her," Leo continued, his voice devoid of mercy. "You starved the woman who belongs to me. You forced her out into the rain." "Leo, wait!" Declan choked on his own blood. "Nobody touches my queen." Bang! The gunshot echoed like a cannon in the underground room. Declan O'Connor slumped backward, a dark hole between his eyes. Leo didn't look at the body. He holstered his weapon, pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket, and wiped a single drop of blood from his cheek. He turned back to Penelope. She was shaking, staring at the carnage. But she didn't run. She looked at Leo, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling against the emerald silk. He walked up to her, his dark eyes burning with adrenaline and raw possession. He cupped her face in both of his large hands, uncaring of the men watching them. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice thick. "No," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm okay." "Good." Leo's gaze dropped to her bruised red lips. "Let's go home." The ride back to Tribeca was cloaked in heavy, suffocating silence. The storm outside had broken into a steady, freezing drizzle, but inside the Maybach, the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder adrenaline and unspoken tension. Penelope sat stiffly against the cream leather, her emerald silk dress stained with a single drop of Declan O'Connor's blood. Leo didn't speak. He kept his large, calloused hand firmly clamped over her knee, his thumb tracing slow, rhythmic circles against her skin. The gesture was territorial, grounding her as her mind raced through the horrific violence she had just witnessed. She had expected to feel guilt, or perhaps terror. Instead, looking at the man beside her, she felt an intoxicating rush of absolute safety. When the private elevator doors opened into the penthouse, Leo dismissed Dante with a sharp nod. "Secure the building. Nobody comes up. And if you find Tommy Sullivan, put him in the trunk," Leo ordered, his voice flat. "Yes, boss," Dante grunted, throwing a respectful, almost reverent glance toward Penelope before the steel doors slid shut. They were entirely alone. The penthouse was cast in deep shadows, illuminated only by the sprawling city lights bleeding through the wet glass. Leo took off his suit jacket, tossing it onto a leather sofa. He unholstered his Glock, placing the heavy weapon onto the marble kitchen island with a dull thud. Then he turned to face her. Penelope stood frozen in the center of the room. The adrenaline was beginning to crash, leaving her body trembling. "Leo, what happens now? You just executed a syndicate, boss. There are rules. The commission—" "Forget the commission," Leo interrupted softly, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped inches away, his towering frame forcing her to tilt her head back. "Right now, the only thing that matters is you." He reached out, his rough hands sliding over the slick silk covering her wide hips. He didn't avoid her size. He grasped it, his grip firm and desperate, pulling her heavy curves flush against his hard stomach. "You hacked a cartel-grade encrypted banking network in 45 minutes, Leo murmured, his dark eyes dropping to her lips. "You didn't even flinch when I pulled the trigger. Who are you, Penelope?" "I'm your secretary," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "No," Leo growled, his voice vibrating deep in his chest. "You were my anchor. Now you are my equal." He didn't wait for her to reply. Leo crashed his mouth down onto hers. The kiss was aggressive, possessing, and entirely devoid of hesitation. Penelope gasped into his mouth, her thick arms instinctively wrapping around his broad shoulders. He tasted of expensive scotch and danger. The sheer physical power of him was overwhelming. But the way his hands explored her body was something akin to worship. He gripped her thick waist, his fingers digging into her softness, pulling her impossibly closer as if trying to merge their very bones. For her entire life, Penelope had been taught to apologize for the space she occupied. But in Leo's hands, under his hungry, devouring gaze, her size was a weapon. It was something he craved. He backed her up against the marble island, lifting her heavy thighs onto the cold stone with effortless strength. He broke the kiss, both of them breathing heavily. "Leo," she whispered, her hands tangled in his dark hair. "They are going to come for you. The 5 families won't let an unsanctioned hit go unpunished. You started a war over me. I would burn the entire eastern seaboard to ash before I let anyone touch you," Leo swore, his eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying devotion. Before he could pull her back in, the harsh, shrill ring of a secure satellite phone shattered the silence. Leo froze, the muscle in his jaw feathered. He didn't want to answer it, but a ringing satellite phone in the Santoro household meant only one thing. He stepped back, smoothed his shirt, and picked up the heavy black receiver. "Speak." Penelope watched as the blood slowly drained from Leo's face. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and unreadable. He listened for 30 seconds in total silence before speaking again. "Understood. Tell the commission I will be there in 1 hour." He hung up, the click echoing through the cavernous room. "They called a sit-down," Leo said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "Carmine Rossi and the other bosses. They know about the meatpacking district. They are demanding my head for breaking the peace." "Then we run," Penelope said instantly, sliding off the marble counter. "You have the money. We can leave New York. A Santoro does not run," Leo stated coldly. He walked over to the sofa, picking up his suit jacket. "I'm going to Long Island. I will handle Carmine." "No," Penelope said, her voice suddenly ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "You aren't going alone." Leo turned, his eyes narrowing. "It is a mob tribunal, Penelope. It is a room full of old, vicious men who want blood. You are staying here behind bulletproof glass." Penelope walked toward him, her emerald silk dress sweeping around her legs. The terrified, invisible girl who had shivered in the rain 24 hours ago was dead. In her place stood a woman forged in the fire of Leo's absolute belief in her. "You started this war for me," Penelope said, stepping into his space, her dark eyes flashing. "But I'm the one who drained the O'Connor accounts. I'm the one who knows how the money moves. You need a shield against the commission? I am your shield." Leo stared down at her, the feral, possessive heat returning to his gaze. A slow, dangerous smile curved his lips. "Get your coat, Miss Sullivan. We have a board meeting." The Rossi estate on Long Island was a sprawling Gothic mansion, surrounded by wrought iron gates and guarded by dozens of men carrying assault rifles in the freezing drizzle. When Leo's Maybach pulled into the circular driveway, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Dante and the Santoro enforcers immediately formed a heavily armed wall around Leo and Penelope as they stepped out of the vehicle. Inside the mansion's grand library, the air smelled of stale cigars and old money. Sitting around a massive mahogany table were the heads of the 4 remaining syndicate families. At the head of the table sat Carmine Rossi, a ruthless septuagenarian with dead eyes and a violent reputation. As Leo entered, the room fell dead silent. But it wasn't Leo they were looking at. The eyes of every mafia boss in the room locked onto Penelope. She walked beside Leo, tall and immovable, her heavy curves draped in silk, radiating a cold, unyielding confidence. "Leo," Carmine rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here, let alone bringing a civilian. A woman, no less, and a fat one at that. Have you lost your goddamn mind?" Leo's hand instantly went for his Glock, his eyes flashing with lethal intent. But before he could draw, Penelope placed a firm, steadying hand on his forearm. She stepped forward, pulling out a sleek, silver tablet from her designer clutch. She tossed it casually onto the center of the mahogany table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping directly in front of Carmine. "That fat civilian is the only reason you aren't all spending the rest of your lives in federal prison," Penelope said, her voice clear, steady, and echoing off the library walls. The bosses bristled. "Watch your mouth, girl," one of them spat. "Open the file, Mr. Rossi," Penelope commanded, ignoring the threat. Carmine frowned deeply. He tapped the screen of the tablet. The display lit up, projecting a massive, complex spreadsheet onto the wall monitor behind him. The men in the room gasped. "When I hacked Declan O'Connor's offshore accounts this afternoon," Penelope continued, pacing slowly behind Leo, "I didn't just find his money. I found his insurance policy. Declan was keeping a shadow ledger of every single transaction the 5 families made through the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Your bribes, your shell companies, your exact money laundering routes through the Cayman Islands. Carmine's face turned a sickening shade of grey. Where did you get this? I have it securely encrypted on 3 separate servers. Penelope lied flawlessly, not breaking eye contact with the most dangerous man in New York. Declan was going to hand this over to the DEA to wipe you all out. Leo didn't break the peace tonight. He executed a rat who was about to sink the entire commission. The silence in the room was deafening. The bosses looked at the screen, recognizing their own illicit fortunes laid bare in perfect, undeniable numbers. "You want blood for the meatpacking district?" Penelope asked, her voice dripping with ice. "Take it. But if anything happens to Leo Santoro, a dead man's switch activates. Every file on that tablet goes directly to the FBI, the IRS, and the New York Times. You will all be indicted before sunrise." Carmine stared at the heavyweight woman in the emerald dress. The sheer audacity, the flawless execution of her blackmail, left the old boss entirely paralyzed. He looked at Leo, who was standing with his arms crossed, a look of profound, arrogant pride on his face. "She is the keeper of the keys," Leo said softly, his dark eyes sweeping over the terrified bosses. "She is untouchable, and as of tonight, she is my underboss. You will treat her with the exact same respect you treat me, or I will let her burn your empires to the ground with a few keystrokes." Carmine Rossi swallowed hard. He looked at the ledger, then back to Penelope. Slowly, agonizingly, the old man stood up and offered a stiff, respectful nod to Penelope. "The hit on the O'Connors is sanctioned," Carmine ground out. "The peace remains." Penelope didn't smile. She simply nodded back, turned on her heel, and walked out of the library, Leo right beside her. The ride back to the city was different. The tension was gone, replaced by the electric, intoxicating reality of what they had just pulled off. Penelope had walked into a room of wolves and put them all on leashes. When they finally returned to the penthouse, the storm had passed. The early morning light was beginning to break over the Manhattan skyline, casting a golden glow through the glass. Leo didn't say a word. He pulled her into his chest, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing. He carried her into the sprawling master bedroom, kicking the door shut behind them. "You played them," Leo whispered fiercely as he laid her down onto the silk sheets, following her down, his heavy body covering hers. "The dead man's switch. It doesn't exist, does it?" "No," Penelope smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I made it up in the car." Leo let out a raw, echoing laugh, a sound of pure joy that Dante and his men had never heard in their lives. He buried his face in her neck, kissing the soft skin, inhaling her scent. "You are a terrifying woman, Penelope," he murmured against her collarbone. "I learned from the best," she replied, her fingers tracing the tattoos on his forearms. He pulled back, looking down at her with a vulnerability that stripped away the Mafia boss and left only the man. "You aren't going back to that desk. You aren't hiding in those sweaters anymore. You are mine. You rule this syndicate with me." Penelope looked up at the man who had found her shivering in the rain and saw the absolute truth in his eyes. She wasn't just a secretary anymore. She was his equal. She was his queen. And as his lips crashed down on hers in the breaking dawn, Penelope knew that the invisible girl was gone forever. And that is how an overlooked secretary became the most powerful woman in the New York underworld. Penelope didn't just survive the Mafia. She conquered it with sheer brilliance, proving that true power isn't about fitting a specific mold. It's about having the brains and bravery to hold the cards. What an insane twist with that fake dead man switch. If Penelope and Leo's dark, romantic Emma building had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more intense, real-life drama stories.